All right, hello, good afternoon, everybody. So I've drawn up a couple things. First, homework's due. Most people have turned it in. If you didn't turn it in yet, you can turn it at the end. I redrew up here the sequence of events in an action potential. We have our resting state of the neuron, where mostly potassium leak channels are open. Those are open all the time, but during the action potential, we're going to have hundreds of times more voltage-activated sodium and voltage-activated potassium channels open. When those voltage-activated sodium and potassium channels are open, you're going to get a lot more of a dramatic effect of them. In order to get the action potential to happen, we need to go from rest to threshold. We haven't really talked about that transition yet. We're going to come back to that probably on Friday, maybe on Monday when we talk. That sort of has to do with synaptic transmission and communication between neurons. But for right now, something magic happens and we get to threshold. And then we talked about the sequence of events, which is there's a rapid depolarization. It peaks out usually somewhere around plus 30 millivolts. Rest might be minus 70, minus 60, or minus 70 millivolts. Different neurons have different resting potentials. Different neurons have slightly different thresholds. I usually use around minus 40 millivolts for threshold, but some neurons might be minus 45, minus 50, something like that. So anyway, we've got, so we have a rising phase. We get to a peak of plus 30 millivolts, and then the whole thing, the voltage reverses, so the current reverses. So now we've got a bunch of positive ions are going to be flowing out, and so we get this falling phase, and in fact, we end up even more hyperpolarized than where we started, and we call this post after the fact phase the refractory period, and this is subdivided into the absolute and relative refractory period, which has to do with whether it's impossible to get another action potential or just difficult to get another action potential. So what questions do people have about that sequence of the voltage, the stages of the action potential in terms of voltage? Sounds like there are a couple questions, but people are afraid to ask. Don't worry. Whatever you're confused about, please let me know. Maybe? Okay. Maybe after class some people come up and talk. Okay, so in addition to that, I drew up at the end of class, these are now the voltage activated channels here. So remember we have our leak potassium channels, but those are sort of boring because they're just always open. So the more interesting channels are these voltage activated channels. There's voltage activated potassium channels and voltage activated sodium channels. And the voltage activated potassium channels are more complicated than the leak channels because whether or not they are open depends upon the voltage. That's where they get their name from. And so some of the time they're closed. So the channel, it's actually made up of 5 different parts that sort of sit in a top-down view, sort of like a little hole in the membrane like this. And so some points in the action potential, that hole is squeezed shut, and then in other points in the action potential, that hole opens up. And so I'm just sort of diagramming that as squeezed together or opened up. And then sodium channels. For the sodium channels, they're even more complicated. They have 2 different parts that can open and close. One is what we call the opening gate of the channel. So that's just again like the potassium channels, either pulled open or squeezed closed. And then there's also this second plug that closes up in the bottom. It's sort of like the front door of my house. There's a wood door and a glass door, and if people want to get through, both doors need to be open. And so there's sort of different. There's sort of two options for me to keep people out of my house, I guess, if I want to do that. Questions about that? Yes?
So how does voltage affect the plug in the actual case?
So what it turns out that inside these channels, there are some positive charges embedded in the membrane, which is kind of hard to do, but the cells figure out how to do that. And so if there's negative charges inside, then the channel gets sort of squeezed down and closed. And then if the membrane inside gets less negative, then the channel can sort of relax itself open. So yeah, does that and then the plug is a little slower to respond to voltage, but it's sort of the converse, where whereas the cell gets depolarized, the plug will go into place, but it's kind of slow to respond to that. Yeah. Actually, we're going to do a sort of group activity basically about that in just a second. But yeah, good question. Other questions? Yeah.
So is the function of like the plug and then just the normal closing essentially the same thing? And so why is it necessary to have two sets? And what would be the difference between, say, like open and plugged and closed unplugged?
Let me be annoying and ask that back to the whole class, actually, but as part of this assignment. I'm going to add that right now. So there you go. You get to be everyone's favorite. No, it extends the time for the group work, which means less time yammering. So that's actually probably good. So actually, I guess we'll just sort of move into this and then come back and discuss a little bit more. So I have 5 questions, 4 now 5. So it's sort of at each stage of this action potential, the rising phase, the peak, the falling phase, the absolute refractory period, the relative refractory period, what are these two channels doing for each of these channels? So for the potassium channel, what's it doing during the rising phase? For the potassium channel, what's it doing during the peak? For the potassium channel, what's it doing during the falling phase? What's it doing during the absolute refractory period? What's it doing during the relative refractory period? And then same thing for the sodium channel. So that's question 1. Then question 2 is, what is causing these transitions between these different states? And also thinking back to your notes from last class period, I mentioned this briefly, but go back and sort of look through some of these transitions happen faster than others, which ones are fast and which ones are slow, and why does that matter? Why do we need slow and fast transitions? And actually 3 and 5 are kind of related to each other. Why do we have the second gate on the sodium channel? And then number 4 also is looking at the channel during which of these, for the sodium channel, during one or more of these 4 states, sodium ions can pass through, and during one or more of these states, sodium ions cannot pass through. So which ones are which? And for the potassium channel, there's just 2 states. One of them passes current, one of them doesn't. So that's question 4. So let's take about 8 minutes or so to work through that. Since it's a long, complicated activity, and it sounds like there are already a fair number of questions, I'm just going to try to walk around. Please raise your hand. It's kind of hard for me to get to you if you're in the middle, but I'll do my best. Okay, I think groups have mostly slowed down a little bit. There may still be some discussion ongoing, but we'll talk about the answers, and you can update your papers as we go a little bit. Okay, so at rest, what's going on with our leak channels? What's going on with the leak channel? Sure.
Okay, so leak channels is always open.
Always open, yeah, right. So that's going to be an easy question as we go on. Leak channels are always open. And as a reminder, the leak channels for a typical neuron might be a total of 20 nanosiemens. The peak amount that you can get through these guys might be 2,000 to 20,000. Let's just call it 2,000 nanosiemens. The peak that you might get through these guys is 2,000 nanosiemens. That's not what they're doing right now at rest, but that's the maximum current we can get through them. For the leak channels, the maximum current is always the current because they're just always open. Does that make sense? A little bit? Okay, so anyway, at rest, those guys are open. What about the voltage-activated potassium channels at rest? What are they doing? Closed. All right. Yeah, we have 2 choices for those. Closed. Voltage-activated sodium channels, we got 4 choices for them. What are they doing? closed. Okay, so I heard closed plugged over there, then I heard somebody else say unplugged. Yeah, sure. Okay, why do you think they're unplugged? Sure, yeah, do you want to, yeah.
Because I think during the rise they opened, so the plug would be just...
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of a weird question the way I phrased it to you a second ago there, but yeah, so in the next phase they're gonna do one transition, which is to open, and if the plug's already there, we're not going to get any current. So they kind of need to be unplugged, or else we're not ready for an action potential. Does that kind of make sense? So anyway, yeah, these guys are closed, but unplugged. Okay, so then when we reach threshold and start to go through the rising period, what's going on with our leak channels?
Nothing.
Well, not nothing, kind of. Nothing's changed, right? So they're open. They're always open. The voltage activated sodium channels, what do they start to do here? Open, right? So they remain unplugged. So we're going to be transitioning from the top left to the top right up there, but now they're open. And actually, while we're at it, let's go to question 4. For our sodium channels, which of those states pass current? Open and just the top right, yeah. So this is the only time when these guys are passing current. It's right here at this state. For the potassium channels, when they're open, they're passing current. When they're closed, they're not. Okay, so during the rise phase, what about our voltage-activated potassium channels? What are they up to? I heard open, yeah. Closed. Closed. Okay, so we got some conflict here. Who thinks that they're open during the rise? Who thinks they're closed during the rise? Okay, a lot more people think they're closed. Does somebody want to sort of explain? So if they were open already during the rise phase, actually this is maybe a useful. So what would our voltage on the membrane be under these conditions of open, unplugged, voltage-activated sodium channels, which means that we have a 2,000 nanosiemen conductance for sodium, and open potassium channels, so 2,000 nanosiemen conductance on potassium, and since they're always open, these are voltage activated. These are our leak, and our leak channels are also open. So what's approximately, and then also remember E and A is plus 60 millivolts. EK is minus 80 millivolts. Actually, let's take a minute and try and figure out approximately what you think the voltage on the membrane would be if we had that state forever. So work with your group. Add that down as a number 6. What's the voltage on the membrane going to be if that's the state? Okay, so that's, well, yeah, let's take about 30 seconds to finish up. Okay, so in this scenario, if we add up all of the sodium conductances, what do they add up to? There's only one type of it, so 2,000, right? So yeah, so we've got 2,000 nanosiemens of sodium conductance. If we add up all of the different kinds of potassium conductance, what does that add up to? 2020, which is basically 2,000. I mean, it's so essentially we've got the same amount of permeability to these two ions. So does anyone want to take a guess about what they think the membrane potential would be at here? Sure, yeah.
Well, I think it's just like reach equilibrium between like the potassium and like the sodium.
So yeah, it's actually not going to quite be an equilibrium, but it would be like what would you, if you were to give a number to it, what would you guess? Anyone come up with a number? Sure.
11.
What's that?
Negative 11.
Negative 11. Interesting. Okay. How did you get to negative 11? How did you get that?
Just right in the middle.
Right in the middle. Okay. Yeah. Did other people get another number? Anybody else get -11? Anybody else get a different number? Get numbers at all? I got -10, which is the average of those two. I'm not quite sure. Oh, maybe considering the extra this, the fact there's a little bit. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, but so I mean, essentially, right? So what's going to happen is, if you have equal conductance of both of these, then they're both. It's like two giants pulling equally hard. And one giant wants us to get to +60, the other one wants us to get to -80. We're going to settle into some steady state in between. It's not an equilibrium because if those conductances remain open, there's going to be a lot of sodium constantly flowing across the membrane, a lot of potassium constantly flowing across the membrane. It's going to waste a lot of, our neurons spend a ton of ATP putting those potassiums and sodiums out, and even though one little action potential doesn't change much in terms of the number of neurons, the number of ions, if we left these open for a few seconds, our neuron would die because it would lose its concentration gradient completely. It would eventually reach equilibrium, but not the equilibrium we want. It would reach an equilibrium of death, essentially. But for a while, we'd be at -10, -11 millivolts. The average between these two giant currents, one of which is trying to get us to +60, the other of which is trying to get us to -80. Does that kind of make sense to people? What question? This is going to come up again in a minute when we talk about number 2 and number 3. So what questions do people have about that? Okay, so over here in the rising phase, what are our potassium channels doing? Most people said that they're closed, and in fact that's right, they are closed. If they were not closed, then instead of rising up to +30, we would just sort of like trickle our way up to -10 and then stay there forever, and not have like a nice discrete action potential that can be useful for the neuron. Questions about that? Does that make sense? Okay, so then at the peak, now some more things start to change. What happens to our leak channels at the peak? Stay open. That's the easy question. What happens to our voltage-activated sodium channels at the peak? Somebody closing their hands, something? Yes?
It's open, but it plugs up.
Open but plugged. Yeah, exactly. So we'll come back to there were a lot of questions about like why that sort of transition even exists, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But yeah, they're open and plugged up. And now our potassium channels, what are they starting to do here? Now this is when they're starting to open. And actually the falling phase is the same as the peak. Again, our potassium channels are open. These guys are still open but plugged. And these, as always, are open. Okay, so questions about that? Okay, so during the absolute refractory period, what's going on with our leak potassium channels? Open or closed? Still open, right. Okay. What's going on with our voltage-activated sodium channels during the absolute refractory period? Sort of over the course of it, yeah. Yeah, so now, during the absolute refractory period, these guys, they close, but they still are plugged up. And so one thing that you'll notice is that the open and closing happens very quickly. When voltage goes to threshold, they open, but it takes a while to plug. When voltage gets back down low, they close, but it's going to take them a little while to open again. So the plug is slower than the open-closing part. So that's one sort of key difference. What about our potassium channels? Yeah, they're still open. Just like the plug on the sodium channels is slow, the opening part of the potassium channels is also slow. And so even though we've gotten back down to -70 or even -75 or -80 millivolts, these still haven't responded to that change in voltage. Okay, and then during our relative refractory period, these are still open. Now what's happening to our sodium channels here? they're still closed. And then what happened to the plug? Yeah, the plug's coming out, unplugged. These potassium channels, yeah, they're sort of in the process of closing. I think actually for this, I'll say that they're still open here, and then add one more, which is when we get back to rest. Now we're going to get back to these guys closed, unplugged, and still open. So they're sort of transitioning during the relative refractory period. But one of the things that distinguishes the absolute versus relative refractory period is that in the absolute refractory period, our sodium channels are still plugged. So no matter what we do, we're not going to get current to flow through them and not get another action potential. Whereas here, we've got still some open potassium channels, but if we give it strong enough stimulus, we can get an action potential. Okay, so we've actually, in the process of sort of working through a lot of that, let me bring this back down here. We've actually kind of started to get hints at some of these other things. So what determines the transition from here to here for our sodium channels? What activates our sodium channels? What's their name? Voltage, right. Depolarization. So depolarization is what causes this transition this way. And this transition happens, so also getting into number 3, this transition happens very quickly. So within less than a millisecond of getting to threshold, these channels quickly open up. What about this? So this transition from closed to open here. What are these potassium channels sensitive to? Voltage, also depolarization. But there's a difference here. So in terms of rate, are they faster or slower than the sodium channels? Yeah, so these are slow to open. So we get a little bit of time between threshold and peak. There's about this magic 1 millisecond time window when our sodium channels are open, but the potassium channels haven't caught up yet. They haven't responded to the change in voltage yet. Questions about that? Okay. So to get from here to here, we need depolarization. So if I wanted to go back, what am I going to need to do? What's the opposite of depolarization? Hyperpolarization, right. So if I wanted to go back here, I need hyperpolarization. We're actually not going to go directly back here, but that's what I need to get back there. And so if I don't have this plug built in, this channel is just going to stay open forever. Maybe the potassium channels catch up a millisecond later, and they open too. That's fine. But then we're just going to be stuck right up in this problem scenario that we were in before. Slightly different situation where now we get up to threshold, sodium channels open, the sodium channels stay open, the potassium channels come off, and now we just hang out at minus 11 millivolts or whatever it is, minus 10, minus 11 millivolts, and stuck there forever. Our sodium channels aren't closing. So the reason for this second plug is because the first door opens for depolarization, but I don't want it to stay open forever when it's depolarized. I want a second door that closes, also in response to depolarization, but just put a little timer on it so that I get a millisecond of this state before that happens. Does that kind of make sense for then why we have this? So we're not going to be able to get back to hyperpolarizing until we stop the flow, but we can't stop the flow without hyperpolarizing, so we're stuck unless we put in a second way to stop the flow. Does that kind of, yeah. What questions do people have about that? That seemed to be like the hardest part of this for a lot of people. Okay, so then this transition here also happens to be depolarization dependent, but it's again slow. So the same thing that got us to open is also getting us plugged, but it takes a millisecond or so before that plug catches up, And that's what gives me that magic rising time window when I have a lot of sodium conductance and a lot of sodium current flowing across the membrane. Okay, so questions about that? All right, so now going from here back, what takes me from here back to being closed? What do I need to do? Yeah, I need to hyperpolarize. I need to get down below threshold. I need to get down to like minus 60, minus 70, minus 80 millivolts. If I'm stuck up at minus 11, then I'm never getting that thing to close again if I'm stuck up at minus 11. So hyperpolarization, and again, this actually happens pretty quickly. This is, again, a quick transition where as soon as we start to get back below threshold, this sodium channel will slam itself shut. And then a millisecond later, or a few maybe 2 or 3 milliseconds later, our plug catches up, which is why we have this 2 millisecond absolute refractory period. So again, hyperpolarization causes this to unplug, but it's, again, slow. And by slow, I just mean it takes 1 to 2 milliseconds, which is 2/1000th of a second. So on like human time scales, that's fast. But for a neuron, that's slow enough to let it do its business. Same thing with this here. I mean, this just takes like 1 millisecond to do. And then our potassium channels are also, how do we get from open to closed? And these guys? Hyperpolarization. And again, just like the plug, they're slow to respond to this. So, and so on this diagram here, the transition from left to right depends on depolarization and is quick. Left to right is hyperpolarization and also quick. The transitions from the top to bottom, again, when you depolarize, you go from one of these states up here to down here. Same thing over here, but the up-down transitions in these diagrams are slower. So that's sort of why I laid them out this way. So you can also sort of see in this that the potassium channels, the way I've diagrammed it, you can sort of, that is a mnemonic to sort of help you remember that they're slow. And so for each channel, we've already talked about which states pass current. It's just this one for the sodium channel and just the open state for the potassium channel. And so, does anybody want to? Oh yeah, sure.
Why is the potassium channel slow? Is it just has less charge embedded?
Yeah, it's just I don't really know fully. Yeah. You'd have to ask a biophysicist that. I could make something up, but it would be likely wrong. So I don't know. I mean, you can. Proteins have different degrees of rigidity in their structure, and so it may just have like a little bit more rigidity built in, which means it takes a little bit longer to respond. But yeah, I don't really have a good biophysical explanation for that. Yeah, what other questions do people have? Yeah, sure.
So this has been bothering me a little bit, but like, so sodiums go out during the exercise.
Sodiums come in. Always sodium goes in.
Potassium goes out.
Potassium goes out. Yes.
Sodiums come in.
Right.
When they're like channels closed, like how do they get back out? Maybe like
yeah.
Potassium could get out. But
Yeah. So we haven't really talked about this, but embedded in the membrane of neurons and all cells actually is another protein called the sodium-potassium pump or sodium-potassium ATPase, and it takes an ATP and converts it into an ADP plus a phosphate, and in the process of doing that, it pumps out three potassium ions and brings, three sodium ions and brings in 2 potassium ions. And so neurons, it's on a slower time scale, but the neuron is 90%, 80% of the energy, the ATP that a neuron uses is just for that purpose. And for other cells, it's not that high, but it's actually still a high percentage in the range of like 30% 30%-ish of the metabolic needs of other cells is also just for that purpose. That's a huge, huge source of or expenditure of ATP. And so, yeah, so in one action potential, there's like a few thousand ions that move across the membrane, which turns out to be a very small fraction of the total number. So it doesn't change the one action potential. Even if the pump's off, one action potential doesn't cause a big concentration change. But if we got stuck in this state where the channels were open forever, then we'd be burning through ions like crazy. Or if we have a lot of action potentials, then over time concentrations could change, except for this pump sort of works to prevent that. And so you'll notice that this is moving ions in the opposite direction of where their concentration gradients want them to go. Yeah. Yeah, yes?
Could you explain the fifth question?
Yeah, so why we have two gates, right. So here we are. So as we go up to the peak, our sodium channels open. And we need that sodium to stop flowing, or we are never going to get back down to negative potentials. But the way the sodium channels are built is that the more positives, so when there's negatives inside the cell, we're like this. When there's positives inside the cell, we're like this. And so our sodium channel is letting in a whole lot of positive charges. And we're never going we have to stop that flood of sodium coming in, or else we're never going to get enough negative charges to close that channel. And so evolution devised this second way of stopping sodium, which is actually now a plug, a stopper, that gets turned on by depolarization. It's slow, but it gets turned on by depolarization. Does that kind of help for that a little bit? Okay, you had a question also, yeah.
So you said it would never go from depolarization or the open unplugged to the closed unplugged. So the reason why that would never happen would be because like the plug is the reason why it wouldn't polarize?
Well, in a universe without a plug, we open the sodium channels, and then a couple milliseconds later, our potassium channels open. But we're never going to get more negative than minus 11, and that's above threshold. And so our sodium channels are never going to close again. Once we're more positive than plus 40, those sodium channels open, and they're going to stay open. So we're going to get stuck at minus 11 millivolts, and we're going to be stuck there forever. And so we need to stop those sodium ions, but we can't stop the sodium. We can't close the channel until we get down to minus 60 millivolts. But we can't stop the sodium ions until we close the channel. We can't close. So you're sort of stuck in a catch-22. You can't get the channel closed without getting to negative, but you can't get to negative until the channel's closed. And so in a world without this inactivation plug, you're never going to get out of that state. Does that help? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So that's actually took more time than I expected, but I think it was useful in working through the dynamics of this. So